Hello, everybody. My name is Abdul Sheikh. I am a program manager in the Patterns and Practices team within Azure Engineering. Welcome to the Q&A session on Azure Architecture Center. I'm going to be assisted with moderating by Cassandra from our stores team. And Cassandra, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Cassandra Stiver. I work out of the Oakbrook store, which is right outside of Chicago, Illinois, and I am a learning specialist. So my job is to train and develop our associates around like product knowledge and services and pretty much any type of priorities that we have going on in the store.
Thank you, Cassandra. Audience out there, welcome. This is my hello world moment. If you know what I mean, I am a developer. I have written a bunch of hello worlds throughout my career, and here is my real hello world. I promise this is the only dad joke you'll see during these 30 minutes, and I might reuse this in another session that I have coming up. So if you happen to be on both, pre-warned. Any questions, feel free to put it on the chat window. What I'll do is I'll wait for a moment to see if there are any questions. If not, what I will do is I'll take a quick overview, take you into the Azure Architecture Center webpage, and kind of talk a bit about how we organize our content and how you can interact with us and provide feedback and how you can leverage our content and all of that, all of the goodness of the Azure Architecture Center.
So we do have one question right now, which says it's from Denny. For a multi-tenant application using a database per tenant implementation using Azure Elastic Database Pool, what could be a good architectural and cost-effective solution to apply to Azure Cognitive Search over the content of those databases while we keep the isolation required for the data of each tenant?
Wow, a very, very specific question. Let me repeat the question back so that I'm sure that I've understood it correctly. Multi-tenant is key, and a database per tenant is key as well. And depending on how you are implementing multi-tenancy, there are a couple of ways I think we can think about. If you are implementing multi-tenancy at the level of your identity itself, that means you have tenant A has its own cohort of users, tenant B has its own cohort of users. Obviously, Azure Active Directory, you have the ability to have multi-tenant, and you can, bring identities across. You can invite from one person to the other person and all of that. But I think the key part of your question was, how can you leverage search across data for each of those tenants? I would think that you could have a common database across tenants in your application. I cannot think of an existing reference architecture or a reference implementation that we currently have that could answer your specific question. What I could do is obviously take note of this and come back and try and provide an answer either in this forum or another forum. Maybe I can present it back in our GitHub repo, and hopefully you'll be able to find the answer to that. Before we get more deep into specific questions, one of the things that I wanted to take this opportunity is to kind of talk a little bit about the Azure Architecture Center and how we are organized and how you as an end user of these content that we have, you can obviously leverage them. Most of them are open source content, but you can also provide us feedback. Very quickly, you have the ability to browse a series of architecture that are already there. You can, interesting, for whatever reason, my browser experience is quite slow. You have categories of architectures, compute, containers, database, DevOps, developer tools, hybrid identity, management and governance. Let's pick compute, for example. You can go and look at a set of reference architectures or reference implementations. You can also have what are called solution ideas, which are a very lightweight discussion of how to go about solving a particular business solution, solving a business problem within Azure, and you have that capability. The other thing we'd like to highlight is that if you go back to the main page, we have the notion of what is new, and I think this is something that our customers had asked us quite a bit. So you can actually come in here and see what is new and what has changed recently. This was just, we had this capability for a while, but we haven't really put it front and center in our landing page. So we encourage you to come look at here and benefit from what is new here. And speaking of the landing page, the best way to get to the Azure Architecture Center is aka.ms/architecture. That's your one URL that I would like to leave with you. And we have another aspect of Azure Architecture Center that I would like to highlight here. What is called the Microsoft Azure Well-Architected Framework. So what we have is the notion of taking any particular Azure workload and talking through what are the best practices for building Azure workloads for whatever is specific to your business problem, but looking at them across 5 pillars of considerations. The cost optimization, operational excellence, performance efficiency, reliability, and security. So there are recommendations and best practices that have been curated, and these are targeted towards architects and developers. So I think this will benefit this audience quite a bit. One additional aspect of this Azure Well-Architected Framework is the ability to do an Azure Well-Architected review. What you could do here is that essentially go through and answer questions about your workload based on these 5 pillars of considerations. And at the end, when you finish this exercise of review or an assessment, you will get curated guidance and next step actions that are specific to what you can improve and what you can get the best bang for the buck. And I think these are something that you will benefit from most. And as we talk about this Q&A here, I wanted to run down and give a quick overview of these capabilities of the Azure Architecture Center. Just quickly recapping, we have a series of reference architectures and reference implementations. We talked a bit about what is new, and I kind of did a very quick overview of the Azure Well-Architected Framework and the associated assessment review. One of the cornerstones of this Azure Architecture Center are the cloud design patterns. And we have I think about 30 design patterns, and every time we discover a set of activity that happens in Azure in the cloud space that we can extract out of a pattern, we come back and update it and add to these library of patterns. And so those are the 4 huge components of Azure Architecture Center. At this point, I think we can go back to the questions. Cassandra, if you could maybe give me one of the next questions.
Yeah, so there are a lot of questions. So I apologize that we probably won't be able to get to all of them, but I'm just going to kind of read off the ones that have a lot of likes. Okay. That's what seems that people want to hear. So this is from Vince. It says, regarding integrating an Azure service with your core architecture, has any service ever been discounted? Would they? What time span will customers receive warnings first?
I'm not quite following the question. Can you please read the last sentence, Cassandra, if you might, again?
Yeah, of course. Has any service ever been discontinued? Would they? What time span would customers receive warning first?
Oh, I see. So this is about lifecycle. Yeah, so one of the things that Microsoft has been very good about is that when a customer takes a dependency on a capability that Microsoft has provided, we have typically had at least a 10-year support lifecycle. In one of my roles prior to this, I used to be a technical account manager, and this was one of the critical aspects that enterprises had. We don't have I'm not aware of a specific lifecycle for Azure services, but what I can say is that I haven't heard of any Azure service that has been deprecated recently. We are launching so many new services, and we are taking existing services and adding more features and capabilities to that. I don't exactly know the answer to that specific question about what is the life cycle and what type of alerts that a customer would get. So having said that, as a business life cycle, Microsoft provides support for a large number of years. One of the ways that I think developers get notified of anything being deprecated is on the SDK. The Azure SDK, the CLI, and the SDK themselves. It may not be an entire service that is being deprecated, but maybe an API that is being deprecated, and there are a series of versioning that happens in that. I think those are standard industry practices, and I would be very comfortable saying that you as a developer could get that notification and alerts based on your APIs, and you will see that in your build warnings and things like that.
All right, so another question is, sorry, I'm just scrolling through them because there's a lot. So this one is anonymous, but there's any recommendation about integrating logs from multiple applications? Oh my gosh, I'm probably gonna butcher this. App service Azure functions with manage ELKs. Any reason to go through Azure Monitor / App Insights instead of sending straight to the services?
App Insights is the centralized service within Azure that I would recommend as actually, let me do a quick search on the question was about log. Yeah, so yeah, your centralized repository for your logs is in Azure Monitor, but App Insights is is your primary source of logging, and each of these services you have the ability to point them to a logging container, and the first party capability is obviously Azure Monitor, but there are also third-party capabilities, open source capabilities. Grafana is a big open source insights platform, observability platform that is becoming very popular and used quite a bit, both internally at Microsoft and at a bunch of our customers. So I'm not sure I quite answered your question because I don't think I quite fully understood what you're asking for. Because there was a mention of not sending to Azure, Azure Monitor. So I'm not sure what was motivating that requirement. But I think I would leave it at this point and move to the next question.
Okay. We have a Cosmos DB that we ingest a lot of data to and is also the data source for a website. What would be good architecture for maximizing the ingestion throughout without starving the website of RUs? Autoscale doesn't quite work for us because of Ingestio can overload whatever RUs can affordably be assigned. I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce all of that correctly.
Well, yeah, this is a good one, right? I talked about design patterns. CQRS is one of a very popular design pattern, and I don't know if we have an example of how to implement separating reads and writes in Cosmos DB. We may have a reference architecture on that. So essentially, configuring your reads and writes separately. I'll try to see if we have a databases. Yeah, streaming scenario. I distinctly remember there was one reference architecture or a reference implementation where we talk about that. So if I'm not able to find it here right away, I'll try and post it in any of the forum feedbacks about this question.
Okay. Okay, it says, this is from Marcos Ramos. He says, Architecture Center has an incredible knowledge base related to the Azure architecture role, but one part of the job is document your choices, design, etc. But there is not much about the topic, neither templates. Is there any plans about this topic?
That's a great question, Ramos. Documenting your application, documenting your solution, and a good application or a good solution, in my mind, should have enough metadata to self-describe. But what happens in an enterprise application is that there are so many layers. There is the network layer, there is the app layer. There are some capabilities that I can think of the top of my mind, at least within the network watcher. You can basically kind of look at where your traffic is going and what your network topology is, and kind of describe that this component is talking to this component. Within the architecture center itself, I don't remember there is any guidance on documenting your application. That may be a good feedback for us to kind of make some investments in trying to talk about, how to keep your knowledge base of your solutions up to date, and persist that for your organization's use over time. That's a good call out. That's something that we could do extra in the architecture center. Thanks, Ramos.
All right, so next question is from Dominic. He says, hi, my question is, assuming you have a MPLS network across 2 different regions and you want to implement 2 separate express route circuits, one to each region, how would you architecture the VNet/networking setup to allow a application to be deployed to the 2 Azure regions and provide HA resistance if one of the express route circuits were to fail? Thank you.
HA, high availability for BCDR. There's actually a reference implementation for that. In fact, you're asking about 2 separate express route connections across 2 separate regions. So we have this notion of express route. So this particular content talks about best practices for express route with VPN failover. So I would encourage you to go take a look at this. We actually have a very good, robust implementation and examples on how to achieve pretty much what you're looking for. It's called on-premises network to Azure using ExpressRoute.
Are you ready for
Cassandra, sorry.
All right, I just don't want to interrupt you. This is from Mimi. What is the recommended app hosting currently in Azure? Is it App Service or AKS? How should we make the choice?
You know, that's a great question. And in fact, making a choice, one of the sessions that I'm speaking later, one of my colleague Alex is going to talk about choosing right. A lot of the feedback that we receive from our Azure customers is that there are so many choices. Help us make those choices. And I think one of our objective is, as part of the Azure Architecture Center, is to help with making those choices. There was an element on, choosing the right technology. So if you come here, this particular question was about, whether, what technology to choose where. So we have like a decision tree that talks about, depending on what you want to achieve, there are different technology choices that you can make. I would encourage you to take a look at this. So we have here, based on a few questions, whether app service is a good fit, or a Azure function is a good fit, containers, which would be Azure Container Services or Azure Kubernetes Services, and whether you would want to maybe leverage a series of VMs on Azure if it makes sense for your application. So this decision tree, I think, would give you a high-level answer, and we'll definitely be able to help you. But what I wanted to also highlight based on that question is that we have some decision trees on data store, decision tree on choosing a messaging service, and a decision tree on load balancing services as well. So we've highlighted that on our homepage. So please leverage that and benefit from it. One other thing that I wanted to say before I take on the next question is that a lot of this content is available in our docs. Azure Architecture Center is part of our docs, but you can, as an end user, go and provide feedback. That is feedback. And you can provide feedback, and this feedback will show up as a GitHub issue for our team. And what we have in our local DevOps is that any issue that gets generated, I'm just going to call this a build test issue. And what it'll tell me is which document this issue was about and who created that issue. So basically, it tells me that I came from here, I came from the docs guide. So it gives me a little bit more background, but we encourage you to give us a little bit of a description of what the issue is so that we can quite understand what you were trying to achieve and what we were missing the bar on, and it'll help improve the documentation for everybody. But what we also want to showcase here is that we have the ability to have an internal DevOps bug that we automatically create. So it shows up in our DevOps instance, and we do a weekly triage and we respond to these bugs. And our objective is to, react to, respond to, and close these bugs as quickly and as effectively as we can, because we take our customer feedback really seriously. So going back to the questions now, Cassandra, if you have another question that you would like to highlight.
So this is from William. He said, what's a good way to architect a Cosmos DB to minimize costs? It is our biggest spending at the moment.
So William, this is a great question. Cosmos DB is an amazing product, and it has a lot of capabilities, but it is also a product that is, that costs quite a bit, I would say. This afternoon, we have a session on evaluating and optimizing your cost using the Azure Well-Architected Framework. And I am doing a demo of how to leverage the Cosmos DB capacity calculator to really go through, and I had it open, but I closed it for this session. Yeah, right here. Cosmos DB capacity calculator to go and really get an estimate of what are the real throughput request units that you need, and how to only leverage the globally distributed nature of Cosmos DB for data that is absolutely necessary, and for your other data capabilities, you want to leverage SQL instance, managed instance, or even SQL as a service. So this particular calculator will give you a good idea of whether you have variable data. If you have variable data, what is the level of variance? What are your requests per seconds, peak and off-peak needs? So you can take some of your workloads. You say that you currently use Cosmos DB, so you probably have a lot of this data already, and then you can estimate and determine. One of the key things that I would call out is, even within Cosmos DB, you have the option of creating what are called reserved instances. And when you create a reserved instance for Cosmos DB, you get a discount of up to 65% if you reserve for up to 3 years. And I think it's about 45% if you reserve up to 1 year. So I encourage you to look at the other cost options of making a reservation, taking some of your workload data traffic and only putting traffic that is needed to be in Cosmos DB, and taking such approaches to minimize cost. This particular session that I'm referring to is session INT 119, and it will be mostly about envisioning and kind of leveraging cost calculator to determine and estimating your cost for the Azure Kubernetes Service RA and RI that we have in our architecture center. But I think it's relevant to your question. Next question, please, Cassandra. We have about 4 minutes, folks. I'll try and answer any of the questions that we couldn't get to, and I'll see if there are any other forums that we can respond back to, and we'll try and get an answer to you as much as possible.
We're currently running heavy workloads on worker roles on Azure Cloud Service, a classic. What's the go-to solution now?
So Azure Batch, if you're running, sorry, which service they said on the classic worker roles? Yeah, so worker roles, it's basically, we kind of look at it as a backend process. So the typical candidates, again, you can go through and look at choosing the compute decision tree, but there are a lot of great backend services. Azure Batch is one of them. And what else? If these backend worker roles, if these worker roles are based on an event, Azure Functions is a good alternative. I'm not as familiar with the Azure Classic, so depending on what aspects of the worker role that you are leveraging, I would say Azure Batch or Azure Functions as an example. And I have seen a customer scenario where they have migrated from a classic worker role into Azure current using a service bus in between. So they basically would take all of their incoming traffic into service bus, and from service bus they would use Azure Batch, and for certain aspects they needed a real-time response for that processing. So they would trigger an Azure function and do the initial processing and respond back, and then they would use the backend Azure Batch to process and complete the entire transaction. This could be like a shopping cart where you go and look up your catalog and say, yes, we have it in stock, so you will get it in 3 days versus you will get it the next day versus you will get it in 3 days, and then your backend batch process, Azure Batch process, will actually do the delivery of the shipping and all of that. We have about a minute. I'd like to take another question and then maybe go over a minute if it's possible. This has been a great experience for me. This is the first time I'm doing something like this. And thank you, Cassandra, as well for your time and helping with the questions. We'll take one last question and we'll close with that.
All right, so last question is, speaking of choosing the right technology, do you have any examples of when you would want to choose Azure Service Fabric or Mesh versus Kubernetes? Do you have any examples of when Service Fabric / Mesh would be strongly desirable versus Kubernetes and vice versa?
So I think this is a classic question about microservices. These are two separate, very robust, very strong implementation. A lot of the services within Azure are built on Azure Service Fabric, and but there is a lot of mindshare and open source momentum behind Kubernetes. So in Azure, we consider both of them as first-class citizens. And at the end of the day, when you make a choice like that, you are going to make it. So you're going to make a choice that you're going to live with that choice for the life cycle of that solution. So if your organization's background and if your comfort level is to go open source, I would encourage you to pick up Kubernetes. Kubernetes, AKS, also has its own strengths and weaknesses, and Microsoft is one of the largest contributor to the CNCF in making Kubernetes accessible and great for everybody. Simultaneously, if you are very comfortable with the Microsoft stack and Microsoft capabilities, we would encourage you to stick with microservices capabilities that are in the Azure platform. One of the things that, in fact, Mark Rasinovich was talking about it just before this session. He mentioned the OAM, Open Application Model, and the notion of you as a developer describing what your application should do in a declarative manner, and then picking whichever one of your compute, network, storage to be able to execute on that is where the future of computing is going. And in between, obviously, you have to make this choice. Unfortunately, I'm not able to provide that guidance on that choice based on the information that I have, but I wanted to provide this background information. And I wanted to thank all the audience for joining. Unfortunately, this wasn't a direct one-on-one conversation. I hope I answered your questions to the extent that you were satisfied with. Please provide some feedback. And if there is any other way that I can reach back and provide answers to some of the questions that we couldn't get to, I'll make an attempt. And if you need to reach out to me at Microsoft, feel free to provide your GitHub issues, and we'll respond to those. And happy build, and have a great day, and thank you for joining. And thank you, Cassandra, for your assistance.
No problem. And I did post a link right now for people to submit feedback on the session. So if you have any insights, you can click on that link and give your feedback.
Thanks, everybody. This was our first experience, and I enjoyed it, and hopefully you guys benefited from this as well. Thank you.